In this activity, we'll be creating a program that utilizes HashMap. Once you're ready, open up Visual Studio Code and we'll get started. Once Visual Studio Code loads, open up your activities directory. We are on activity 19, so double-click on A19. Once the activity file loads, review the topic and program requirements. Attempt to implement a solution on your own with the video paused. Once completed, resume the video and I will demonstrate my implementation as well as provide insights to the activity topic. All right, let's dive in. This topic is HashMap. The requirements are to print the name and number of items in stock for a furniture store. If the number of items is 0, print out of stock instead of 0. The store has 5 chairs, 3 beds, 2 tables, and 0 couches. We also need to print the total number of items in stock. Our notes say that we need to simply use a hash map for the furniture store stock. To start out, I'm going to use the HashMap data structure by typing in use std collections HashMap. That will give us access to the HashMap. I'm not going to have any functions in this program, so I'll just stick with the main function. I'm going to create a HashMap called stock, which will represent the items that are in stock. And that will be created using HashMap new. I will then insert the items that the store has stocked. Okay, so that should cover the store stock as we see up here in our program requirements. Next, we need to iterate through each item and print out the information. I'll use a for loop for that. We're going to iterate through the key value pairs. So this can be item, and I'll use QTY for the quantity of items in stock.iter. When we use .iter on the hash map, it iterates through the key value pairs, so we get a tuple that contains the key and the value. One thing to remember with the requirements is if the number of items is 0, we need to print out of stock instead of 0. To facilitate this, I'm going to use a string that specifically just contains the number of items or the out of stock message. And then I'll compose that with another string that will then print out the entire statement that we need to print. To do that, I'm going to create a new variable. I'll call it stock count, and that will be an if expression. So if quantity equals 0, we'll just return a string that indicates out of stock. We'll need to use an owned string in this case. And if the stock is greater than 0, then we will just print out the stock using the format macro. And that will have the number of items, which is QTY, as we see right here. The format macro, it's similar to the print line macro, except instead of printing the line on the console, it's just going to put it into a string instead. So you can type your tokens in here just as you would with the print line macro, but instead of printing it and just throwing everything away, we can save it into a variable. In this case, we're saving it into the stock count variable. That way we can use it later. Next, we just need to print out the information. Item equals, and then I'll just print out the item name, and stock equals, and we'll print out the stock. One last thing we need to do is print the total number of items in stock. So we need to keep a running total, and we iterate through this. To do that, we need to make another mutable variable. I'll just call it total stock. We'll set that to 0. Each time we go through this iteration, I'm just going to take the total stock, and I'll set it to itself, plus the quantity. And then once the loop is finished, we can print out the total stock. Before running this program, I'm going to walk through it so we can see how it works. So the first thing we're doing is we're using the HashMap data structure from the collections library in the standard library. We then have our main function. We're creating a mutable variable named stock and setting it to a new HashMap. We then insert the items that are in stock for the store. We have chairs, beds, tables, and couches, and each one has its own quantity. The names are the keys, and the quantities are the values. We then track the total number that are in stock with a mutable variable. We set it to 0, and we're just going to add to this number each time we go through the loop. That way we get the total stock. This type of variable is also called an accumulator because it just accumulates data. In this case, it accumulates a number into a bigger and bigger quantity. Next, we have our for loop. So we iterate through the key value pairs of stock. So the item is the key and the quantity is the value. We then increment the total stock by taking the total stock plus whatever quantity we may have here. Next, we create a string that indicates either the message out of stock or a number which represents in stock. So we check here. If the quantity is equal to 0, we'll have a string out of stock. Otherwise, we're going to create another string using the format macro, and we simply use the quantity into this token, and it will display the quantity as a number. And remember, the format macro saves it into a string instead of printing it out directly like the printline macro does. So the stock count will contain a string either out of stock or the number that's in stock. Next, we simply print out the item and the stock. So the item is taken from here on the iteration, that's the key. And the stock count is this string that we created right here, which is out of stock or the number. This will go through every single item that's in this hash map. So it'll execute 4 times. Once that's completed, we'll then print the total stock by printing out the total stock variable, which was created here and was increased in value on this line here. Let's save this and we'll see what happens. As we can see, we have an error. We're unable to compare a reference to an integer with just a plain integer. As we can see on line 29, here's our error. So we can fix that. We go to line 29. We can see the error occurs right here. Now, the reason we got that error is because when you iterate through a hash map, these right here are automatically borrowed. So all we need to do is borrow our 0, and then it'll work just fine. So now let's run this. We are on activity 19. So you can do -q -bin A19. And as we can see, our stock has been printed out along with the total number of items that are in stock. We can confirm this by checking the information here. We see that chairs is 5. That's good. Tables is 2. That's good. Bed is 3. We're good. And the couch is 0, so it printed out of stock instead. And the total stock is 10. So we have 5 plus 2 is 7, plus 3 is 10. That checks out as well. That concludes this video on the activity about hash maps. I'll see you in the next presentation.